I have a million things, I'm sorry, and I'm going to try to do them in the order that I planned. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors, Ellen Hansen and Richard Perlman, who have underwritten this series and make us all very happy. Next week, we have the New York Times bestselling writer, Susan Isaacs. No, not next week. Do not come next week. In 2 weeks, we have still the best-selling author, Susan Isaacs. The flash fiction Fright Night last night, it's very hard to pronounce, was a roaring success. It was terrifying, actually. The winner will be announced at the MFA reading on December 5th. And that is my opportunity to invite the graduate students, particularly those who have not yet read, and I know who you are, to sign up as quickly as you can. Unfortunately, we lost a week of prep and me begging you, so you have to sign up in the next 2 days for the December 5th reading. The rehearsal will be from 4 to 5 on the 28th, the same day that Susan Isaacs reads. It's a maximum of 3 pages or 6 minutes. Priority is given to students who haven't read yet, and you have to be an MFA student in our program to read. Then we have the last victim of Hurricane Sandy is that, unfortunately, even though we have this wonderful writer here, we do not, who I cannot introduce because somebody else will. We do not have his books, but we have wonderful labels that he will sign for you, and they will be attached to a book which will be delivered to you. If you are not in the program, we'll mail it to you, and if you are, we'll hand it to you. So please buy a label. And then the last thing is just that I wanted to introduce our celebrity guest MFA introducer, J.D. Kayola.
It's so bright. Bret Anthony Johnston's work ranges from magazine articles to film, from anthologies to editing contributions. While he is best known for his debut short story collection Corpus Christi, one particular piece does prove to be intriguing. In Esquire magazine, the company received a strange letter from a reader. Proving his willingness to venture outside the confines of mundane action, Johnston decided to write a very short story based upon the letter, titled The End of Summer. In it lies the betrayal of a brother and a husband by his brother and the wife. It is usually improbable to capture such cutting drama and circumstance in less than a page, but Johnston does just that. In addition to Esquire, Johnston's work has appeared in such notable publications as Paris Review, Oxford American, and Tin House. Awards for his work range from the Glasgow Prize for Emerging Writers to the Christopher Isherwood Prize, as well as the James Michener Fellowship and the Pushcart Award. He is also the editor of the best-selling Naming the World and Other Exercises for the Creative Writer. His first attempt, Corpus Christi, received wide praise. It is a collection of separate, yet somewhat connected stories of individuals living out their lives in Texas. One such story, Anything That Floats, revolves around an unsatisfied wife and mother who meets with her lover from an affair, all while her husband is lying in a hospital bed somewhere else. The meditation upon the imperfections of the individual, how the needs and desires of a person can overtake responsibility and trust, is a theme in some of Johnston's work. Most recently, he was a contributing writer for the documentary Waiting for Lightning, directed by Jacob Rosenberg. The film chronicles the efforts of pro skateboarder Danny Way as he attempts both to transcend an abusive childhood as well as make a jump over the Great Wall of China. It was first shown at the South by Southwest Film Festival in Austin, Texas this past March and will be released on December 7th of this year. He is currently the director of creative writing at Harvard University and has skateboarded for over 20 years, so, beat that. Being interviewed by MFA faculty member and former New Yorker writer Dan Menaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Bret Anthony Johnston.
Y'all remember that show WKRP in Cincinnati? That's suddenly how this feels to me. So if y'all could call me Venus, Dr. Venus Flytrap for the next hour, that would be great. So much for that. Well, thank you, JD, for that amazing and somewhat true introduction. And thanks especially to Susan Merrill for inviting me, and for Dan Menaker to endure what's about to happen. I'm going to read a short story, and then Dan and I are going to talk. I just wanted to say first and foremost that it's really an honor to come and talk with writers. This is the kind of thing, the kind of community that I always longed for. When I was a student writer, I didn't really go through anything like this. I went to an MFA program eventually, but it took me a long time to understand what a writer's workshop even was. So just to know that something like this exists, and let alone something like Writers Speak, it means more to me to be here than it means for y'all to be here. So, so again, thank you. So I'm just going to read a short story. I guess in addition to, I turned in a novel a couple of weeks ago, and I guess I'm about halfway through another collection of stories. And one of the things that's happening in that collection is I have a bunch of regular sized stories, and then I have a bunch of smaller stories like the one that JD mentioned, that I kind of think of going in between the longer stories, almost like, just the connective tissue for these longer things. So this will be one of the shorter ones, and it's called Cayman. Did I already thank everybody for coming? Yeah. You feel sufficiently thanked to be here? Okay. And I told y'all to call me Dr. Venus Flytrap? All right. This is called Cayman. Your mother wouldn't let me bring the ice chest into the house, so I left it in the garage. Earlier, I had cut 4 holes into the styrofoam lid. One of them looked like half a star, which I remember liking. This was years ago, a windswept Sunday. This was Texas. When I returned to the kitchen, she pointed at the sink. She said, "Wash your hands with soap." She was breading flounder. She had been listening to radio reports about that little girl who had been abducted. So had I. Probably I pulled over and gave that man $80 because I thought it would keep you safe. He was parked under the causeway, a hand-lettered sign propped against the tire of his van as if he were just selling pecans. Your mother had flour dust on her neck. She had already fried okra, boiled potatoes. Soon we'd call you to the table, and you, our little man, would bolt in like you'd heard a starter pistol. You were 7, a boy who liked bedtime stories with fantastic monsters and twisty, unexpected endings. You liked sneaking up on us. You hid behind closed doors and in the laundry hamper, then jumped out screaming and laughing. You loved the word maybe. Maybe I'm a kid who's 1,000,000 years old. Maybe we should be a family with a pet. Maybe someday my eyes will turn blue. Your mother swiped her forehead with her wrist. The kitchen was gummy with the day's heat. The windows were open. Before leaving that morning, I'd mowed the yard. You helped me rake. You wore your cowboy boots. And now, with dusk coming on, the cut grass smell was rising and trying to cool everything off. She's still missing, your mother said. Now they think the uncle did something. I nodded. I had heard that too, and if it was true, I thought he'd get killed in prison. But I didn't want to talk about such things. Instead, I asked, "How's our little man?" "Worn out," your mother said. "He's napping in his room." I had been all day at the job site, drawing overtime. On the drive home, I'd seen the man under the causeway and pulled over for a look. Our ice chest was still in the bed of the truck from when we'd gone floundering. I took that as a sign. And he only had one left, which also seemed lucky to me. I was excited to surprise you. I was excited to hear what you would name it. "Now," I said, "I wonder what he'll name it." "He asked for a dog," she said. "A pet," I said. "He asked for a pet." "Right," she said. "A dog, a cat, a goldfish. Pets have fur and show affection. Pets aren't deadly." "Goldfish don't have fur," I said. I didn't think she was angry, not really. I took 3 glasses from the cabinet. I said, "And it's not deadly." She fixed me with her eyes. She said, "It's an alligator." "It's a Cayman," I said. "There's a difference. It's the size of a shoe." "Not for long," she said. She turned back to the stove. She laid one piece of fish in the skillet, then another. Grease started snapping. "They're smart," I said, repeating what the man had told me. "They won't mate until the river is high. They make sure there's enough water for their offspring. They build nests." "They're cold-blooded," she said. "They have scales." "Danny can take it for show and tell," I said. "They bite," she said. "They escape. They escape into sewers and terrorize neighborhoods. They eat regular pets." I laughed at that, but your mother just said, "They do." She flipped the fish in the skillet. The sound of frying started up again like distant applause. She blew hair from her eyes, stood with her hip cocked, holding the spatula. The applause quieted. She slipped the fish onto a plate she had covered with a paper napkin to soak up grease. She put 2 more pieces of fish in the pan and watched them sizzle. She said, "Why would that man take that little girl?" "We don't know that he did," I said. "But you think he did," she said. "Yeah," I said, "I do." "I do too," your mother said. "You know she's Danny's age." "They could still find her," I said. "But you don't think they will." "I don't know, honey," I said. "I just don't know." "Well," she said, "I don't think they will." She lowered the flame on the stove and turned to stare out the window. She was touching her fingertips to her thumb, one after the other, something she did when she was concentrating. The air in the room was shifting. She said, "What would we do if something—" "It won't," I said. "Not to him." She nodded. She pressed the heel of her palm to her eyes. She said, "We're still getting a dog." "I know," I said. "And you owe me a new ice chest," she said. I poured milk for you, but returned our glasses to the cabinet and opened up 2 bottles of beer. The meal was starting to feel like a celebration, like one of us had gotten a raise or was having a birthday. I found some cocoa mix and stirred it into your glass. "An alligator," your mother said, shaking her head. "Cayman," I said. "You know that some husbands bring home candy, right? Or roses, or God forbid, diamonds." "They're poor wives," I said. "They probably never—" "Hey," she said, "hey, tell Danny you caught it. Tell him you were fishing and you saw it and you caught it just for him." "You want me to lie to our son?" "I want you to make up a story for him, something with a happy outcome," she said, and turned off the stove. She went to the refrigerator and took out the tartar sauce and a salad she had been chilling. The wind lifted the curtains over the sink and sent a few paper napkins gliding off the counter. Your mother closed the window, and the kitchen went as quiet as a secret. And then, with the wind shut out, we could hear your boots on the floor in the hallway. You were stalking toward us, planning one of your sneak attacks. Your mother sipped her beer. The flower was still on her neck. It looked like snow, like a smeared galaxy, and she was smiling a little. I understood what she didn't. You had been awake the whole time, listening to us. You already knew about the Cayman, about the flimsy, hopeful story I'd tell, about everything else. The only surprise left was that I did believe they could still find that little girl. I thought her uncle might prove everyone wrong. Maybe he cooked her favorite meals, played her favorite movies. Maybe he never touched her. Maybe such extravagant, misguided love was still possible. As a baby, you liked putting your feet in my mouth. You'd laugh until you got the hiccups, and your toes would move behind my teeth as slow as coral, and I ached to spare you all of what was to come. I wanted to bite down, to crush your perfect bones, to swallow your body whole. Your mother knelt to pick up the strewn napkins. You were just on the other side of the door now, trying not to giggle and preparing your ambush. Maybe you knew we were on to you. Maybe not. I joined your mother on the floor. I felt like we were praying, or giving thanks, or mourning. The kitchen tile was cool, hard. We were listening to you breathe, waiting for you to strike. We were on our hands and knees, our bodies low to the ground, like strange and ancient creatures.
That is one weird story. It's a great story. It's better hearing it even than reading it, because I think hearing it gives you some ideas of the author's intentions. But let's just start. What I plan to do is sort of talk about that story and then talk about Bret's work in a more general way. And since he is the head of a writing program, maybe talk a little bit about teaching writing and talk about his book, Naming the World, which is a collection of writing exercises by writers. All of it very impressive. He is the best person to work with, and I think I can say that there may be 2 or 3 other best people to work with, but in all the years that I've been an editor and publisher, there's nobody better. No one more cooperative, no one more open, no one more sure of what he was doing, and nobody more talented. So let me...
Thank you. Good night.
So did you mean this story as far as you know what you meant? Because I know that's an issue of yours, intention. Did you mean this story to be filled with mysteries?
I don't know.
Why did you choose the second person?
There's a couple of things. First of all, can we just pause and I don't know if y'all know that, and I think this is okay to say. If not, we'll just edit it out. That Dan bought Corpus Christi. Dan, when he was an editor he was at HarperCollins, and then he moved to Random House, and he took me with him. So, in no small way, and this is not hyperbolic at all, but Dan Menaker changed my life. And I want to thank him for that.
My wife would say the same thing, but not necessarily with such unambiguous pleasure.
Well, I'm one of the 3 best writers you know.
Let me just respond to that. You'd have done it anyway. I'm a firm believer that I don't believe in the proprietariness of editors or publishers. I don't believe in it. When people say they've discovered somebody, or when people say they've championed someone, yes, it makes a difference. But over the long haul, for 10, 20, 30 years, most writers, with a few maybe cataclysmic exceptions where somebody's very mean to a talented person and cuts their career off, most writers are going to find their way. You'd have found your way, but I appreciate the compliment anyway. I mean, there's no question you needed to do the writing you were doing, and you were going to do it. So let's have dueling.
Okay.
Dueling.
Right, yeah. You can be WKRP's Johnny Fever.
Okay. Let me go back to the second person.
Well, what I was going to say is that this story, the story had kind of two roots. The first was that I was in a pet store and I heard a mother tell her son, pets aren't deadly. I was just walking by, I was trying to get dog food, and I heard her say, pets aren't deadly. I guess the son had asked I don't know what he'd asked, and that line of dialogue stuck in my head, and I just started thinking, well, is that true? Could a pet ever be deadly? And what would make a mother say that? So it started there, and then when I was writing it, the second person, my original kind of idea was that it was going to be very postmodern. It was going to have this ending where all of a sudden you weren't listening to the characters, but you were listening to Bret, and it was going to be very fancy, and it was going to be very smart. And I wrote it, and it was just abysmal. It was just horrible. And so the second person aspect of it was that I needed the second person to get to my fancy postmodern ending. But then the fancy postmodern ending really sucked. And so then I went back, but I liked this premise of pets aren't deadly, and I liked this guy buying the Cayman. So the second person is just sort of residue in a way. It's a byproduct.
the mysteries I spoke of, this is a father speaking to his son, as I recall, years later.
Mm-hmm.
And did you ever think of what had happened to them in those times? And did you want the reader to think about what the present circumstances of the story are?
I definitely want the reader to think of that, and I'm every time I read it, I'm struck by the line, "This was Texas," and so I think of them no longer being in Texas. I think of them as for better or worse, having moved out of there, and this was a moment in the father's life that he wanted his son to recall. There seemed some persistence in something that had perished that he wanted his son to recall and find shelter in.
So his son, perhaps, in order to understand this story, would have been, not to nail it down too much, but would have been in his 20s or 30s, maybe?
Definitely an adult. I think of it that way, right?
Okay. I mean, my thought is, and you can just tell me if I'm wrong, if it ever occurred to you, that the mother is dead.
That's very possible.
Did it occur to you?
Absolutely.
Did it occur to you from the beginning, where the father addresses the son just right at the start?
It didn't occur to me in the early drafts of the story, but as the story began to find itself, that was very much in the forefront of my mind. That wasn't an original conceit of the story at all. That just started to manifest. Yeah.
How many revisions did you do?
I don't know. I always do a lot. I always do a lot. I'm not being coy and I'm not being modest, but I'm just not a very good writer. I don't mean that as like, oh, tell me how great I am, Dan. What I mean is,
I already did.
That
I'm not going back there.
I know, but I'm with these two other jerks. It takes a really long time for my drafts to get where they're readable to anybody but me. So the early drafts of the story, I don't remember how many there were. What I remember is it turning a corner once I got rid of that horrible postmodern thing. That's when the story pivoted into what it became.
There's one line that struck me as much as "This was Texas," which seems almost like an epitaph of some kind. And that is the sound of the frying, like distant applause. Can you talk about that simile a little bit? Or would you rather not?
I remember that I had a teacher, Frank Conroy, and he said that his idea was that similes needed to narrow the focus as opposed to broaden the focus. So anytime I write a simile, that always comes up in my head. If I see as or like, literally I hear Frank Conroy's voice, and I ask myself, is this just here because it sounds good? Is this just here because it's pretty or indulgent, or is it actually doing something for the story? Is it actually bringing the reader deeper into the story as opposed to making the reader think about the writer? And this one, it withstood that pressure. I thought the sound of fish frying does sound like distant applause, so it can stay.
But it's more than that, too. I mean, it sounds as though what it does is make it sound as though what's going on is a performance. I mean, it connotes performance, and in a way that seems to me to be very fitting with the nature of the story, because it's a moment that's small but has great drama in it, and one of the implications being that something tragic may have happened, thus the applause, thus the fact that there's no audience except that the frying fish sounds like an audience, and the man who's telling the story may be aware of the larger scope, because he says something near the end about sparing, which is, so a lot of your stories seem to me to be about secrets and hiding. This one's filled with secrets and hiding, and in very short order. Is that something you're aware of in court, or does it just happen?
I think it just happens. What I find myself constantly interested in is where people take shelter. And what you've just described are two places where people take shelter. They have these secrets, or they hide, metaphorically or literally. And I'm constantly interested, both as a reader and as a writer, in where do people go to hide, or where do they take shelter? Where do they find comfort when the trouble is really, really raining down? And that continues to resonate with me. And I suppose that'll always be a part of my writing until it no longer resonates.
It's funny that you talk about shelter, and I mean that where people seek refuge or protection, because what a story writer does is sort of the opposite in a way. It's an exposure of those refuges and secrets. The boy here is an audience, evidently. And that, I mean, this is a postmodern story, whether you want it to be or not.
Thank you. Finally.
Because the boy is bearing witness to, I mean, the boy can't answer the father because the father's just telling him, this adult child, this story. But at the time that it was happening, he was there listening to the secret argument or discussion, right?
Absolutely.
And were you aware of the sort of layers of audienceism, for want of a better word?
I absolutely was aware of the audienceisms, but only after the story pivoted. Only after, because I didn't recognize that the son would have been listening in the first incarnations of this story. It was when I had that fancy, very, very intelligent ending that I've mentioned. It had nothing to do with the son. It had to do with the writer, and it was just off. And so when I went back and started to pay attention to what was in the story, there's the line early on, which is saying that he liked to hide, he liked to sneak up on him, and that's when I was sort of surprised, and as a writer myself, I was surprised to realize that the son had been there all along. I had no idea.
The father's wish, going back even further when the boy was a baby, that kind of carnivorous urge that he had, that seemed to me to do two things. Well, first of all, let me ask you.
No, let's just go back with what you were saying.
Just what occurred to you? What occurred to you when you had the father saying, "I felt like I wanted to crunch your toes," and so on? Did you have intention there? Was it just love of that devouring kind that parents feel, or?
It was the love of the devouring kind, and it was that they had been listening to reports about this girl who'd been abducted, and I think the father was remembering that had he been able to do what he wanted to do, which was just to consume this boy with his love, then he wouldn't have to grow up and worry about these other things.
So that's what's so I mean, it's almost a violent image, but it's also protective.
Right. Is that what you were thinking?
Yeah.
Great. I feel like I'm being quizzed.
No, you're not. I'm always curious about I don't care, like you, I don't really care about a writer's intentions, but as long as I have you here, I'm going to grill you about them. Like a flounder.
So I've seen.
Like a flounder. Like a flounder to distant applause. Well, more immediate applause, I hope. But I don't really care in a way because, as you've said in the piece in The Atlantic about writing, a writer can intend anything he or she wants, but that doesn't matter. Once it's done, and it doesn't, in a way, belong to the writer anymore. So I'm just curious. What I also like to show I like to try to show how smart I think I am, and sort of point out something to a writer that he didn't realize. But I don't think I'm going to be able to do that with you.
I'm just lying, Dan. I'm just trying to think, well, Dan might think this, so I just say it. But yeah, I mean,
what's the relationship in your mind between the Cayman and the girl's disappearance? Sorry, let me rephrase the question. What's the relationship between the father's purchase of the Cayman and the girl's disappearance? Is there any?
I mean, I think the father would say that he had been listening to the radio reports and it got him thinking about his son and he wanted to do something for his son. And so it's a causal relationship. I don't know of anything else. What else is there?
Well, there's violence in the air.
Yes.
And this was Texas.
Yes.
So I'm thinking that the father may really deep down also harbor, as we all do, some rage and violent feelings that he is a civilized person and loving parent is controlling the way we all do, but that the purchase of the Cayman may be an evidence, at least it was to me, of what the mother says. The mother says they eat, they eat other pets, just the way the father wanted to consume the boy.
Right. Absolutely, yes.
Are you lying again?
Absolutely not.
You do weird stuff in the structures of your stories. This turns at the end. And the other two more recent stories that I've read of yours, Paradeability and Help Me, the clown story. Oh, that's Paradeability.
Right.
And the Hensley?
Soldier of Fortune.
Soldier of Fortune. All three of them, which I take it are post-Corpus Christi.
That's right.
And I believe also in Corpus Christi, they have a technique which I don't know if it's a deliberate one or not, it's not exactly surprise endings, but it's a way of, it's like you have a telescope and you're looking through it here, and then suddenly near the end, the telescope gets much longer and you see much more closely what's going on, like the Hensley girl dying being in the Air Force or whatever she was and dying wherever she died. Iraq, was it?
Afghanistan.
This twist, these twists, which are earned, they're not mechanical. Are they something that are they a technique that you're aware of as a technique, or do they happen to you? Did you know the boy in the Hensley story was going to have sex with the girl when you started it?
No reason to read the Hensley story, everybody.
Fuck them.
Exactly.
I want to know.
Did I know? No, I did not. No, I did not know that. I mean, I
there's this expansion that happens often near the end. I mean, here it's like the boy has been listening all the time, and suddenly, in a way, the boy becomes like the reader. I mean, becomes part of the audience. We're a really distant audience. And by the way, writers have really distant audiences. That image really sticks in my mind. But the idea of accordioning, either expanding or contracting a story, I'm wondering if it's something that you now feel as part of what you do.
I understand what you're asking. I don't think I think of it going into a story, but I just really like stories. I mean, it sounds so inane to say, but I really like stories, regardless of the size, whether it's a short story or whether it's a short story or a novel or a novella, a movie. I really like stories where something happens. I like for something to happen. And so what I try to do as a writer, and certainly I try to foster this in my students is to write toward surprise and to find a story that has the potential to surprise you. And so when you're talking about Soldier of Fortune, I had this idea of, I don't remember the first line of the story, but it's something like, except for 2 years, this girl had lived across the street from me. And I just started to wonder, why those 2 years? What was it about those 2 years? Why wasn't she there for those 2 years? And I just sort of followed that to the end of the story. I followed that thinking there was going to be some surprise there. So that's what I try to do. I try to follow characters into the dark to let them surprise me. And I think that's where the endings come from, because I want something to happen. So I write toward where I think something is going to happen.
There's this, let's see how to ask this. The writing exercises in naming the world. Do you practice some of them? I know that you contribute 4 or 5 or 6 pieces in it. Do you, when you teach writing, do you practice some of those techniques?
Yes.
Can you tell me which ones, or some of them that have worked well?
I mean, the way the exercises got in the book was, if they worked well, I put them in the book. So I think they all work well. I think they all do ask different things of the writers. Kind of going back to like what we were talking about before with why I'm so happy to be here, is that when I went to school in South Texas, and there certainly wasn't a creative writing program. There was one creative writing class, kind of, but it really wasn't a workshop. And so I never knew what a workshop was. When I the whole time I went through undergrad, I didn't know what a workshop was. I thought of the term workshop made me think of my father's garage. It made me think of, like, you go out there and there's a bunch of scrap wood and there's a bunch of parts from engines and there's a bunch of tools, and you go out there and you build stuff, or you take something apart and you put it back together. That's really what I thought a writer's workshop would do. I thought we would go in, put our stories on the table, and we would dismantle them and put them back together so that they worked better. When I first took writing workshops, it was nothing like that. Everybody was talking in these very highfalutin ways, and they were talking about theme and symbol and all this stuff that my brain just didn't work that way. I didn't know where to begin a scene. I didn't know how to get a character in and out of a flashback. I needed those tools. And so the only way that it's ever made sense to me to talk about writing is in very practical, applicable ways. And so in the workshops that I teach, we do all kinds of things like that. We do all kinds of exercises, or I'll give them a homework assignment that they'll come back and have done a week later. And when we're talking about stories, I never talk about theme. I never talk about intention. I never talk about any of that high-minded stuff. I really question, does this story have too many characters? Is this person does this character deserve to be in the story? If not, we need to kill him off. I kill off a lot of characters in my student stories. I do.
Because there are too many of them, or because they don't contribute, or because...
Both. Yeah.
Or because they distract from the theme? Oh no, not that. I mean, yeah, any of those things. But we kill off a lot of characters in my workshops. The stories, to go back to the accordion thing, stories tend to get smaller in my workshops, because a lot of times they'll come in with, a brother character who doesn't need to be in the story, and so that's it for the brother. In the piece in The Atlantic that you wrote in response to the famous dictum, write what you know, you reject that advice in interesting ways. Can you summarize the piece for those who haven't read it? Who's read the piece in The Atlantic? Ooh, a lot of people. Good. Well, summarize it anyway. Then summarize it more briefly and take the brother out.
Right. Summarize the piece. Don't write what you know.
But as you say in the piece, that's sort of impossible not to in a more extended.
I feel like when people write what they know, I feel like it puts the story in an inferior position, and ethically I'm against that. I feel like when you write about an experience that you've had, or you base something on a reality or anything like that, what it does is it mandates that the story is beholden to something larger than itself, something that has preceded it. And therefore, when I'm reading that story, I'm no longer thinking about the story. I'm no longer thinking about the characters. I'm no longer thinking about the language. I'm thinking about what inspired this story. I'm thinking about the author. And I'm thinking about what this story is actually, quote unquote, about. And I don't like stories being put in that position. I don't think stories are about things. I think stories are things. And so that's what it is. I don't like the story being denigrated to being less than. I think the story has to exist on an equal playing field. Otherwise, I don't know why we're doing it.
At the New Yorker 1,000 years ago, we got a series of stories, one after another, that we published by Susan Minot. And one of my colleagues there came into me and said, these are practically autobiographical. And he took great exception to that. And I said, I don't care. I don't know the writer. I've not met her. I don't know if they're autobiographical or not. I mean, I take your word for it, but that's not how I read them. Mm-hmm. But how would you, let's say I did know that they were very closely related to events that happened in her family. How, if they read like stories and you never met the person, do you care? What if they read the way you want a story to read and yet turn out to be deeply autobiographical?
Then I would say that the story has transcended its material, its source material, rather than relying on its source material. And I think that's a testament to Susan's craft. I think it's a testament to her surrendering her intentions to the larger story. And I think we can all think of many, many examples that do just that. I think those examples are far fewer and far between than stories where the source material eclipses it, because the source material is so much stronger than the story, because the writer hasn't taken it through enough drafts. The writer hasn't surrendered to the narrative as opposed to the history.
That's good. The narrative.
Thank you. Good night.
There was another writer at around the same time. I don't know if you know her name, Ann Cummins. Mm-hmm. Okay. She was writing, the first story she wrote for the New Yorker was called Shiprock Fair. And she lived in Arizona. And it was fabulous. And the same colleague said, now that's more like it. And I said, you don't even know. It might be, verbatim her experience, but what it is a good short story, mm-hmm. first and foremost. And so we had this Minot Cummins argument. He just didn't happen to know anything about Ann Cummins. Mm-hmm. So I think she would pass your test, whether it's autobiographical or not. That is, if the story to the reader ends up being primary, right, and its genesis secondary.
Right.
Let's go back to stories not being about something. That's very provocative to me. How can a story be made of words? And how can a story be the product of a writer thinking of what ought to happen here and there, and who's going to feel what about which event, without being about something? I think your stories are about things, but I'm sorry.
I just think that aboutness is really, really dangerous in the same way that source material is really, really dangerous, because I think it can crush a story. I think writers can start to put something in because it confirms a theme, or because it really drives something home. And my feeling is that largely theme is, like symbol, the job of the reader. I think it's the reader bringing all of their experience to bear on the story, and the story being strong enough to sustain that pressure. Okay.
Do you think that, I know this is speculative, but do you think if you know Henry IV and Henry V, the Shakespeare plays?
Do I think I know them?
No. Do you know them?
Go on.
Okay. If you know them, do you think that Henry IV, part 2 or 3, and then Henry V, do you think they're not about growing up? About when Hal rejects Falstaff?
Right.
Do you think that that's not fair to say, or not even interesting to say, that they're about maturity?
I think it's... I think a sophisticated reader could argue that persuasively? Absolutely. Am I less interested in what it's about than seeing him go through the troops in disguise? Am I less interested in that? Or am I less interested in what it's about than actually seeing Henry move through the camp and everything? I'm far more interested in seeing him interact with people than knowing what those interactions are, quote unquote, about.
This is really important. Can you describe in any more detail why you're interested in those interactions? I mean, that is to say, what matter, as Shakespeare would have said, interests you in the responses to the troops and Hal's responses to them?
Can you rephrase that question?
Okay.
And by the way, I was really hoping we would get into a debate about Shakespeare tonight. That's I was just hoping it would go that way.
What was that about? Okay, let's take your story. Let's go back to your story.
We can talk about Shakespeare.
No, let's talk about your story. Let's talk about Cayman. It's funny because I'm not having a hard time reconciling the very careful process that you use and that you've described to us, and also the writing exercises in Naming the World, with this rejection of subject, not theme, but subject. I would prefer that word. Okay. As if somehow the story were like a thunderstorm, simply to be experienced, not about anything, just a phenomenon. But that empties it of cognitive. The reader is evidently free to think about these things, but you would rather have the reader not think about them, aboutness. You'd like them to put the story down and simply have experienced it in some primal way without a lot of cognitive machinery.
I want them to experience it first. I want them to experience it in a your word, in a phenomenal sense, and I want the story to stay with them and be strong enough for them to return to it again and again and again.
And do what?
Experience it on levels that memory and recollection will reward. But but the experience has to be first. I don't want readers to puzzle through a story wondering what is the writer getting at. I really don't want that. I want them to, if you're kind enough to say all these very nice things about the story Cayman, I want them first and foremost to think of a man and a woman in a kitchen. That's what I want the story to be about. If they can tease more out of it, if they find more there, then great. But I feel like the job of the writer is to make us believe that there were a man and a woman in a kitchen and their son was on the other side of the door listening to them, and that there's a Cayman in the ice chest. That's the job. And I feel like if we can do that, then all of the other stuff will be there. It will be freighted in. It will be smuggled in. But if we start with that subject of aboutness, I don't think we get to the man and the woman in the kitchen. I think it has to start there and grow as opposed to coming up with these grand ideas and trying to shove it into the kitchen.
In some ways, I agree with you. I feel that way very much about movies, that I want to, and they're viscerally much easier simply to accept as phenomena because they're visual and they're audible and people are moving around and you can just sort of soak it in. But my problem is that ever since college, what we do is what we would do and what I've done ever since then is go to a movie and then come out with a friend or two or three friends and say, you know what that movie was really about? It was really about doors. Closing. Did you notice all those doors that were closing all the time? Sometimes they opened, then they closed, and so on. And that was fun. But we experienced them the way you want. See, I would argue that first reception of the read should be almost demented. It's just soaking up.
Yes, I agree.
Okay.
Did I?
Well, no, but then I think where we differ is that I think that if something's good and something is complex, as your story is, that after you soak it up, you can stop there if you want to, but I think it's rewarding to squeeze the sponge.
I agree, and I appreciate you saying that. I just what I'm arguing against is a kind of writing that doesn't allow you that first sensation, that kind of writing,
narrative of story,
of surrender, of empathy, of experiencing someone else's life. And I feel like a lot of times stories keep me at a distance because they're preoccupied with the intellect as opposed to allowing me to empathize.
So just one more question, then maybe we'll take some from the audience. And it's from the distant audience, hissing like a flounder in a pan. This is brother. This conversation is brother to the argument or the position that you have in the Atlantic piece about not writing what you know, because some of the vicious comments after that piece, which I'm sure you didn't read.
I didn't even know there were vicious comments.
There were wonderful comments.
Good.
And there were vicious comments
Okay,
too.
great.
But some of the more critical, shall we say critical ones, say that you're sort of trying to have it both ways, which is to say that basically writing what you know, writing autobiographically, trying to replicate one's own personal experience on the page, which you also say is impossible, which I agree with, by the way. But the effort to do so will end up being unsuccessful as fiction, as a story. But then you say, of course, whatever narrative one's going to make up is going to be based on one's personal experience. So can you sort of mathematically explain how it is that we should use our own experiences but not, have them take over? Is that sort of not be the point of thing, but just the raw material, like bricks?
Sort of. And where I have trouble is when a writer, whether it's a student writer or a famous writer, says, well, I can't change that because that's how it actually happened. And I feel like that's the real sticking point for me. I want the writer to understand that the narrative truth can transcend the actual facts of the material. And I don't want us to be afraid of that. I don't want us to be beholden to something just because it happened. There's I think it was Richard Price has a really clever line about this. He says that God is a, I guess I'm already in trouble. Basically says that God always got it wrong on the first draft. It's our job as writers to improve upon the story. And I don't think we should be afraid to do that. I think when the story takes over, when it veers away from reality, I think that's a very good sign. I think it means the story is becoming larger than what we experienced, which means it will open itself up to a readership, as opposed to just being interesting to the people who experienced the original quote unquote story. I think that's how literature has sustained itself, is by being accessible and mattering to people who weren't there. And that's what I'm arguing for.
You also say in that piece, I lied before, there's one more question. You also say in that piece that one reason you think writers don't go there, don't go outside, is something to do with fear, being afraid of something.
Mm-hmm.
Can you remind me?
Oh, it in some ways that was, if I said earlier that I'm always kind of writing toward a surprise, that was the surprise to me, and it was me figuring out why do I believe that writers shouldn't always write what they know? Why should we open ourselves up to writing what we don't know or writing what we're afraid to know? And the surprise was that part of me wonders if the reason we cleave to what we know and we write what we know and we're afraid to let the story take over, if we're not afraid that somehow what becomes of it, if we allow ourselves to write what we know, write what we don't know, if we're afraid that will outlive us, if that will become how we're remembered, as opposed to actually what happened. And for me, that's actually quite comforting. I mean, and Alan Gurganis has this wonderful phrase, and he says that for him, he does believe in an afterlife, and it's called literature, and that's comforting to me.
I think the few times that I've ever strayed, well, it's interesting to quantify, as some people have tried to do, how much in a story is, quote, true and untrue. It seems to me that if it works as a story, it's all untrue in the literal sense and all true and all very true in the emotional and psychological sense.
Right.
But I would rather say that in my experience, and I this is a question, and I swear it's the last one, when I've made things up that seem to me true and right, mm-hmm. I found it frightening. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of writers who cannot unmoor themselves from the more strictly autobiographical nature of their fiction, are actually fearful of losing themselves to what they're creating.
That's what I'm saying.
Said?
Yeah.
Sorry.
That's it. That is it. And I'm not even lying. That's exactly it.
Because it's scary. It's scary to be taken over that way.
Right. And to lose yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
To find yourself. Questions? Please? Yeah.
I'm curious, when you write now, whatever your personal challenge or struggle is that you work with the most, is it's the same as what you found, when you first started writing? Have your struggles or challenges evolved as time's gone on, or is it the same issue and you always find yourself having to work with it?
I've found that every new thing I write presents a whole host of new problems. I mean, I think that's the dirty secret, that you have to relearn it every time you start something. You know, so I feel like I have the same old problems, and then when I start something new, there's a bunch of new problems. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Do you think you're better?
What I think I've gotten better at, and maybe this will be a better answer for you, what I think I've gotten better at is choosing which stories to write. And I think that has been a huge help for me. I think when I started out, I would have all these ideas for stories, and I would try to write all of them, and they would all be sort of horrible. You know, they would sound like, you know, they would sound schizophrenic in a way. You know, I think what I've done now is I figured out, oh, that would be a great Dan Menaker story, or that would be a great Alice Munro story. And I've been able to kind of focus and say, that's a story that I could write. It doesn't mean that it's going to be a great story, but it means that it'll be a story that I can finish. And that's sort of all I ask.
I've heard bathos in my life, but Dan Menaker and Alice Munro in one sentence. That's truly pathetic. Anybody else, please? Can't see very well. Roger.
This may not have occurred to you, and I don't think it's important that it did, but it just occurred to me. Why is the father telling the son the story?
I think the father wants the son to remember that day. I think the father wants the son to remember that his parents were trying to have a conversation about him, in a way about their love for him, and they couldn't even do that without him being there. And I think somehow that's important for him to remind the boy of. The truth is, I have no idea, but that sounded decent.
Yes.
You started out by talking about the workshop experience, discovering workshops, and teach workshops. Do you still go to workshops? Who do you show your work to before you know it's good, know it's done?
I have a few readers that I 3 or 4 or 5 that I'll trade work with, and I don't really go to workshops anymore, except the workshops that I teach, and I do still kind of come out of those workshops feeling the way I did when I would come out of a good workshop as a student, which is I feel invigorated. I feel like I want to go home and read and write, and I feel lucky to have spent the last 3 hours surrounded by writers and surrounded by people who care about characters and events that never happened, and people who care about the 26 letters and their infinite combinations. You know, that's invigorating for me. With the people that I trade work with, everybody sort of has their own function. You know, I'll send it to this person knowing that they're really going to help me with the big picture. I'll send it to this person knowing that they're really going to help me with the language, you know. And then there's a couple of people over the years that I've sent things to, and it's kind of the opposite. And you know, if they really, really like this story, I know that it's a clunker. But if they hate it, I'm dancing on the other end of the phone, you know, thinking, oh, this is going to be something good, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not a writer, but in my work I do drafts, so to speak, and it's occurred to me watching you guys that this is a process that I feel I go through, which starts with the way you kind of create the draft very intuitively, and then the critical mind takes over, and I just assumed that was always a kind of a process that was sort of intuitive, critical, so you work your way through. I'm sort of watching your resistance, in a sense, to answering sort of the kinds of critical questions that, in a sense, dissect the process, it occurs to me that maybe your rewriting process is more kind of layers of intuitive rewriting as opposed to critical, and that's a new idea for me. Are you critical of your work in a sort of analytical way when you're doing your second and third and fourth and fifth drafts, or are you trying to stay in a kind of a more intuitive zone as you develop your piece?
I think it's a little bit of both, and I think it's I think for me everything comes back to empathy, and so I don't necessarily think in critical terms, except to say, am I reaching the level of empathy here that I aim to reach? Is there still too much residue of Bret in this character, or is the character quickening and coming to life on the page in the way that I need him or her to? And I strive draft after draft after draft to lose myself, to get myself out of the stories. And I feel like that's what happens draft by draft, is there's a little bit less of Bret in there. And when the story is done, it's, I hope, because Bret is gone. I feel like a lot of times you hear writers say, I write to express myself. And that has never been my interest at all. I really don't. I really don't think that I have anything interesting to say. I really don't. I write to escape myself. I write to get out of my head, to get out of my experience. So that's part one of the answer. Part two is that I think of it in kind of like engineering terms. I think of it as like a phase shift. I think that when I'm generating material, I'm using it's almost like a manic experience. And then when I'm revising material, it's far more calculated, and I'm looking at the structure, and I'm looking at the pacing, I'm looking at just how a sentence is constructed, and so, but I'm never thinking about the kind of analytical things that we're talking about up here. And one of the reasons you see me struggling is because I just don't think that way. I just don't. I'm interested in empathy far more than I am the intellect. That's just who I am, for better or worse.
Yeah.
A life and a career as a skateboarder, where you're essentially trying to prove your own value using the same mechanics available to everybody around you. How does something like that inform your experience as a writer?
I would like to thank you for using the word career in relation to my skateboarding. I never had a career as a skateboarder. I've just always loved skateboarding, and it's always been a huge part of my life. And I do think of it in terms of writing. I mean, I think of them as parallel experiences, in that it doesn't make sense to me to give up on things. And I don't mean to sound romantic, but it doesn't, once I sign on to something, I won't give up. I just won't. It's not in my DNA. There's plenty of things that I won't sign on for. There's plenty of things that like what I was talking with you about, that I don't think that's a good story for me to write. But once I feel like I've locked in on a story, I'll take it through, 20, 30, 40, 50 drafts, and I won't give up until it's done. It may not get published, but I won't give up on it. And I think that in a way comes from skateboarding. Skateboarding, like so many sports, comes down to repetition. It comes down to doing the same thing over and over and over again until you get it right the first time, and then doing it over and over and over again until you can do it again and again and again. And you're going to fall a lot, and you're going to get hurt, and you're going to get discouraged. And I'm still interested in getting up. I'm still interested in going back to it. And I think somehow a lot of writers aren't. I think a lot of writers give up. They'll give up on a sentence, or they'll give up on being a writer. And you know, because it hurts them. It hurts them to have something rejected. It hurts them to have a bad review or something like that. And it hurts me too, but it doesn't hurt as bad as, you know, doing the splits on a handrail, you know? And so, I mean, if I think, okay, I got a bad review. Well, it's not as bad as when I knock my pelvis out of alignment, you know? That's the gauge for me, you know?
Anyone else? I thought.
One over there.
Yeah.
Hi. What sentence, story, lyric, or verse do you wish you had written?
What do you wish you had written?
This is a long conversation.
Counting on it.
Yeah, right. There are lyrics, stories, novel verses. I mean, it's countless that I wish I had written. You know, this quote gets attributed to either attributed to Saul Bellow or to Henry James, and the quote is, "Every writer is a reader moved to emulation." And I think we write because we read something that we wish we had written. I mean, I'll be honest and say I wish I would have written Blood Meridian, you know?
Amazing.
So, I mean, I wish I would have written Joni Mitchell's A Case of You, you know? I mean, this could go on for a long time.
Yeah, but it's a great drinking game. I mean, it's a great bar game. You no, not Blood Meridian, that piece of crap. I can't believe you said that. Great Expectations and Sweet Little 16. Those are the two things I wish I'd written, in case anybody wants. Anyone else? Yeah, someone who hasn't. Yeah.
Going back to this whole aboutness conversation, I'm just curious what your feelings are about, I mean, and maybe you can correct me if you think my perceptions are wrong, but somebody like Richard Ford writes these really beautiful sentences. And you write really beautiful sentences, but they're mostly short, at least in this story anyway, they're very to the point or short, and they say a lot in a little, whereas Richard Ford tends to write these sentences and the sounds just kind of work together. And to me, that's a kind of different thing happening than what you're saying. I mean, you're in it kind of in the moment because you're appreciating the sentence, but the sentence isn't necessarily connected to this empathy idea that's in the story. And I'm wondering, you know, kind of how you feel about that. Is it too much of now we're about thinking about the writer? Knock Richard Ford.
No. I would say that I hope that the sentences are directly related to the character, especially like this with a narrator. I hope that they are the sentences, the words that he would use, as opposed to the words that I would use. You know, one of the things that people have been kind enough to say when I've given a reading or something, and it's always, I always take it truly as one of the highest compliments anybody could give me, is they'll say, you know, you're really funny. Your stories are really sad. What gives? And nobody likes to laugh more than I do. Nobody likes to make jokes more than I do. But very often the characters that I'm interested in, and the times in their lives, they're not really in a funny place. They're not really thinking about humor. And so I've tried to surrender to them. I've tried to give them the floor. And so the sentences and the language and the word choices, they should all relate to the character's consciousness as opposed to mine.
Except for goldfish don't have fur. I
believe you would say that.
I do too, but I think you snuck in there a little bit. One more? How are we for time?
We're over, but it's okay.
Okay, let's do one more.
My question is, how do you teach? Like, you specifically, what do you do when you teach?
It's very it's very practical. It's very almost pragmatic. We look at, when a student submits a story, we look at the various components of the story, and we try to isolate the things that are working really well, and we try to isolate the things that aren't yet at their highest functioning capacity. I really do believe that writers learn as much from their success on the page, from what they're doing well, from what the reader is responding to. I think they learn as much that way as from where they're having trouble. And so we spend equal time on what's working as in the same time on what isn't working. The trick in my class is always being able to take it back to the text and never saying, well, I really love this story because I too have a brother. You have to tell us why you love this story because of the brother in it. You have to find it on the page. Same thing where the stories are having trouble. And again, it's just because that's how it worked for me. When somebody would point to something on the page, I could understand that. I couldn't understand it when they were, up in the stratosphere talking about how this doesn't relate to the larger theme and everything. I needed to get the people in the truck and on the highway,
He has a truck, by the way. Not only does he have a truck, but he's always had a truck, it turns out, because he's from Texas, right? Basically. He saw me in Southampton walking along. He said, Dan, I looked over this big black pickup truck, and there's Bret in it. I was very impressed.
What kind of truck?
It's a Nissan Frontier.
Oh, okay.
Is that
That's a good, no, that's
good?
a black one is especially good.
Oh, good. Yeah, Dan's been talking about it for a few hours.
Well, I never had a truck, so, I guess we are over. But if someone really needs to ask something, we could wedge one more in, or we can just say, thank you very much, Bret. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.